My name is Liz Arredondo, and I'm a visiting scholar at mediaX. I'm also a robot personality designer at Catalia Health. And we have a really exciting panel for you guys this afternoon. And what we're going to do first is let the panelists introduce themselves. Everyone will talk a little bit about their background, where they're coming from in terms of this topic of children and AI. And then we'll get into the panel discussion. And then near the end, we'll be able to take some questions from the audience. So thank you guys so much for being here. And I will turn it first over to my left, to Dan.
So I may welcome to the Graduate School of Education. It's a beautiful room. And with your support, we can make a beautiful building. I have to say that as dean. So I have a little mission creep. I'm not really going to talk about AI and children. I'm going to sort of talk about two different traditions of AI. So one version of AI is you're trying to model the human mind. The other version is you're sort of trying to model the human brain. And I think they're good for different things. So here's an example of an educational application that's based on modeling the mind. It's symbolic AI. It's the attempt to capture in formal representation how people think. And so this is something called a teachable agent. The way it works is the student adopts a computer character, teaches the computer character, and then the computer character reasons based on how it's been taught. So I'll try and narrate this. So I'm now picking my agent, Betty. And the way I teach Betty is I hook up her concepts. And this is a map of greenhouse gas effect. So now I've taught my agent. And my agent then goes on a mission and has to reason while I'm not there. And so I'm arriving, and the agent has to tell this robot how to fix the planet, because the planet has some global warming problems. And so now the agent's reasoning, this is where the artificial intelligence is. The agent's trying to figure out how to decrease heat energy. And so the agent's chaining through the concept map using causal reasoning, that dark surfaces increase absorbed light, which increase heat energy. And then the agent makes a decision about what to tell this robot to do to fix the planet. And then this very strange graphic that always bothers me. The robot has taken action and saved the planet by doing the right thing. So the basic idea is the computer can model human reasoning and make that reasoning visible. And it always reasons correctly. I teach my agent some knowledge, and then I see my agent reason with that knowledge. So this has some surprising benefits. Students will study twice as long to teach their agent than they will to learn from themselves. So it's a good motivational benefit. They learn the science content quite well. The surprising thing is they learn how to reason. They learn, and there's something about me telling you, teaching you my ideas, and then seeing you reason correctly with my ideas that helps me reason, to learn how to reason. So we've done this in causal reasoning, which is this one, logical reasoning, hierarchical reasoning, quantitative reasoning. In each case, we find that the students learn to reason better, and they transfer it to new situations that don't look like the situation we taught them. So that's symbolic. We take the AI, and it's trying to represent it, and we let the student teach it and see how to represent that and reason with that knowledge. The second approach is more what people hear about AI these days. It's sort of how the brain works. So here's a little assessment game that a child is playing, and they're trying to figure out sort of the rules of tug of war. And so the kid is dragging these characters around to see. Once the kid thinks he or she knows it, she then gets a series of challenges where he or she has to predict what's going to happen. So blue wins. Blue wins. Getting tougher. And then it says, that wasn't the right answer, back to the practice screen. Shows the child what was the problem they missed, and if they have good inquiry strategies, they'll reset the problem to figure out what happened. So this is actually an intentional assessment on our part. We're making 10 to 15-minute games that kids play, and we can assess things like critical thinking, desire to seek feedback, and other topics. Here, so the way we analyze this is then we use traditional AI. And we say, in the first round, we say, look at how they did in the challenge room. Challenge room is where it's basically a multiple choice. And we use that to predict how well they're going to do on a post-test we give them outside of the game. It turns out the performance that they show in the game isn't perfectly correlated with performance outside of the game. So this is very typical. You put people in a video game, educational game, they look really, really good in the game. You take them outside, they don't look as good. And in part because in the game they're capitalizing on very situation-specific things. So what we did is we then used a technique called reinforcement learning to look at their pattern of inquiry. And it turns out if we look at their pattern of inquiry, we can predict their learning better than if we look at how right and wrong they are. So this is an interesting finding, right? It's not whether you got it right or wrong, it's how you went about learning it. And so this, we use sort of the new type of AI, which is trying to learn on its own what's going on in the environment. So two different types, two different uses. The second one's very good for pattern finding. The first one's very good for modeling how people think.
So I come to kids and AI from an entertainment and gaming background. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about myself and how I got here so you'll understand the perspective that I bring to this. So I started out getting a BFA in video production, which sounds kind of incongruous, but actually the skills that I learned there are really beneficial about how to tell stories through visuals and sound, how to create flow, how to engage an audience, and that did carry right over into game development. I started out working in art and animation in video games and then eventually got into design. So my first job in the games industry was working with Humongous Entertainment. I don't know if anyone's heard of them, but back in the 90s, they were a big maker of edutainment CD-ROMs for kids. We had a whole cast of characters, Pajama Sam, Freddy Fish, Putt-Putt, Spy Fox, and I was an animator on the team. All of the main characters were hand-drawn animation, so literally pencil testing, flipping pages, and then we'd scan all those frames in and ink and paint them. So they were all starring in games we called Junior Adventures. A Junior Adventure was an interactive story where the player would control a main character and they would explore a two-dimensional world. And they were all often called point-and-click adventures because you'd use the mouse cursor to point where you'd want the character to go and then click it and the character would go there. And of course, in this world, you're going to meet lots of characters who all seem to have problems. And so you interact with the characters, figure out what their problems are, and solve them. So it taught a lot of critical thinking skills, logic, and problem solving, a lot of the soft skills that some of the more purely educational games didn't always touch on. So after that, I moved to London and worked at the Sony London studio. And I was part of the iToy team. Now, iToy was a peripheral for the PlayStation platform. It's a camera that you would put under your television and point at you and the living room. And you would use your body motion to interact with the game on the screen. So you would see yourself and you'd see objects, and then the camera would register wherever there was a change in pixels, so registering that as motion. So you could beat up ninjas, you could hit objects as part of an exercise game. There was like a whole, you could make burgers. There was no limit to the games that we made using this interface. Later on in the platform's life, we added some color tracking peripherals. One of the limitations of the original camera was that it could only register an interaction where there was motion, where the pixels on the screen were changing. And so later on, we introduced color trackable peripherals. And the camera, as soon as it would see that color, it would treat it as motion. So instead of having to use what we used to call a wavy button, where there'd be a button on screen, you'd have to sit there and do this until the button filled. You could just hold the sword or the pom-pom or the toy in front of that button and it would fill, and the interactions were a lot more accurate. And you could also have face-to-face interactions with characters, which used to be impossible when you had to be able to see yourself on screen. So that was great. I learned a lot about physical gaming and how and why that's fun, especially for kids and families. The camera graduated to the PlayStation Eye on the PS3 platform. So higher resolution, games that had more adult kind of themed graphics. There were kind of artistic interactions like this Blackbird experience where you would just move in front of the camera and the blackbirds would flock wherever your motion was. Then I also worked on a really cool project called iPet. iPet was AR before AR was a thing. So we shipped the game with an AR card that you would put on your living room floor or your coffee table, and then the system would draw a ground plane based on the orientation of the card. And then this little 3D character, this pet, would appear on the screen and run around and play in your living room. And you could interact with him using motion. He reacted to sound. And there was a lot of elaborate technology that went into this game. Like he had a real-time fur shader that would respond to your petting, to your blow-drying his fur when you were styling it. It was really pretty cool. Okay, then I moved to California and started working at Leapfrog in Emeryville. I figure you're probably familiar with Leapfrog if you have any experience in education and educational products. They made my first iPad before there were iPads, like an indestructible tablet with a touch screen, microphone, a little D-pad for gaming, and released a multitude of educational apps. So I made a whole bunch of wonderful, fun games when I was there. I loved working there. So we'd be given curricular topics, so reading, math, physics-based puzzles, and then usually an intellectual property that the game would involve. So an IP like Barbie or Dory and Nemo, and then we would create games that would teach the curriculum starring that character. Following that, Leapfrog produced a system called Leap TV, which was physical gaming for kids. It involved a convertible controller that could either have a classic game mode or you could extend it into a wand, kind of like a Sony Move, if you're familiar with that. And there was a camera, again, amazingly. This happened completely by accident, actually, but a camera for physical and motion-based gaming. So we did some great games, including like Barbie Princesses, where you got to use the wand to flick Rapunzel's hair to choose word and spelling answers, aim the wand as if it was a hose with Paw Patrol, another IP that if you have kids in your life, you're probably familiar with. But my favorite part out of any of those Leap TV games was the princess dress up, because as you played through the game, you got to unlock a bunch of different outfits, and then you got to go into dress up mode where the outfit would be on the screen, and then you would line up your body with it and be able to take pictures of yourself. And we got a lot of really great social media pictures of dads dressed up as princesses. It was pretty awesome. Okay, now I am working at Anki Robotics in San Francisco, and this is Cosmo. He is a very sophisticated little robot, small in stature but big on personality. He has an incredible amount of abilities. He can map his environment. He has a camera that he can recognize your face. He learns your name and can recognize you again over time. He has 3 power cubes that register motion. He talks to them via radio waves, so he knows if they're moving and if they're in his vicinity. And he has this wonderful, very expressive face with these digital eyes. We have a whole character and animation team on top of robotics and UI and game design who animate him using traditional animation software, Maya, which is used in DreamWorks and Pixar films, and then export those animations onto the robot. And having that character sensibility brought to the robot, I think makes all the difference, because if you've ever seen or played with the Cosmo, I think you can understand that he's very endearing, and you quickly forget that he's actually mechanical. But he's a smart little guy. So why have I done this for 23 years? So a friend of mine called it the science of engagement. I love trying to figure out what engages people's brains. Like, why do they find something interesting and entertaining, and why would they play with it for hours and hours? The whole concept of play is interesting to me. What makes something fun? What makes something boring? How can you stimulate the brain cells in a way? And it's different for everybody across ages, across cultures. I'm always looking for new ways to educate, to entertain, cool stuff to do. And kids are my favorite audience, which is also why I'm here. They're a very tough audience. They will always tell you exactly what they think of your game in no uncertain terms. But when they appreciate it and are having fun, there is nothing like it. And I also love that if you create a quality experience, you can make an impact on somebody that can potentially last the rest of their life. So definitely in terms of kids and AI, I think we have a responsibility to create high quality experiences with a lot of subtlety and care, because that's going to build a foundation in their mind about what robots and what AI, what it is and what it's capable of.
I spent a lot of time in LA as a screenwriter. I jumped between the family space and the not family space. But for the last 5 years, I've worked at a startup called Pullstring, formerly Toy Talk, and I wound up writing, designing, creative directing a number of conversational experiences for kids. So just to get into it, the three ones we're going to talk about are Winston Show in the Movies, Thomas and Friends Talk to You, and more recently Nickelodeon's SpongeBob Challenge. So in this one, this was an interesting one because when I came on, there was a bunch of conversational content with this character Winston. It was very much sort of, what's your favorite this? Have you ever that? What do you think this is? Etc. So I kind of wanted it to go in a different direction. So the thing I thought of was make-believe. And the idea would be that by using sort of the conceit of a movie, the child could play a character in the movie, and Winston would be, their co-star. So it was the worst possible crossbreeding of improv and scripted, because we were locked to a script, but the kids could improv their brains out. But we did our best, and what we wound up doing was building a film noir and a space adventure, because we had the reverse shot mechanic using the iPad's front-facing camera, so we used black and white to put them in the detective story, and the sort of Star Trek screen thing to put them in the space one. Yes, that's my son. So we'll see how that looked a little later. Then, sort of off of that work, we wound up getting engaged by Mattel. So then we built a conversational app featuring Thomas the Tank Engine. And this one was really interesting because our previous apps had all been designed for kids about 6 to 11. This was for 3 to 6. So that's a really challenging group. Getting them to learn how to use the microphone button, very tough. Understanding what they say, very tough. Getting them to talk, very tough. But we worked really hard. We found a number of great solutions for that. More recently, it was the SpongeBob Challenge. This is on the Amazon Alexa platform, so you don't see anything. But in this case, we built a memory game where various sort of difficult customers would roll into the Krusty Krab, and they'd give you an order, and and they'd make life as tough as possible. And then you'd be asked a question about the order, and you'd have to remember what it was. And then we'd use the SpongeBob characters for sort of feedback and encouragement. So that was sort of the concept phase. This is when we figured out what we were going to do, and oftentimes we had to sell it to the client. So it's sort of an interesting thing because you wind up selling the medium as well as the concept kind of all in one. Conversation's very new. The next part of what we did was actually production. And this involved sort of hand scripting conversation trees in an IDE that we used in the building. And that was a lot of writing dialogue, anticipating what people will say, hoping your conversational design guides the child in the right direction so they know what to say, and then working like crazy to debug and iterate and capture all the different intents, which we did all by hand. But the main thing when you design these conversations is making kids feel not just heard. Heard is like the basic part. Heard and sort of powerful and important. Because someone could say, yeah, no, all day. Once you get them like making a big decision or saying something that gets really celebrated or that swings the story in a new direction, that's the kind of engagement and interaction that actually is worth something. Particularly when you're entertaining children as opposed to helping them do their taxes. We then went on to testing. And in this case, on our own IP, this was often at the CEO's house with kids from his kid's school. And we would sit around the corner while they were playing with a notepad going, please, speech recognition, please work, please, oh my God, please. Later on, actually, with Thomas the Tank Engine, we got to go to Fisher-Price and test in their two-way mirror room and use their expertise, which was amazing. But so in there also we learned a lot about how to engage kids, how to test with kids, what the different sort of feedback things mean. And then, at long last, the thing happened. So we made In the Movies, which was a make-believe based gameplay. And then when we built the second season of the Winston Show, the whole thing was built around make-believe. We had a doctor sketch that was sort of a secret empathy exercise. We had a detective mystery, space adventure. We had a bunch of shorts where you'd be a mother bird, you'd teach a baby bird how to fly, or you'd explain to a zebra why you were going to eat him, that kind of thing. Thomas and Friends Talk to You. People are still playing this apparently, which is wonderful to hear. But this was also sort of conflict resolution, good behavior versus bad behavior, solving mysteries, all with the child as being the most important person in the scene. Thomas desperately needs your help in every scene, and it's up to the child to provide the key information, provide the encouragement, be the person who actually brings the story to a happy conclusion. That was always a really fundamental, important part of the design. SpongeBob, not quite as ambitious, but just a really fun memory-based trivia game that was one of the first 3 kid skills for the Alexa platform. And so far it's doing very well. We're very happy with it. And then I also worked on some other things. Speak-a-Zoo, Speak-a-Language, Speak-a-Tree. These are very sort of simple you and the character kind of conversations where you're helping them solve a problem or helping them with their feelings, or just making friends. And that's it.
So it's a great pleasure to be here at mediaX at this panel and at the School of Education. My name is Lee Jung, and by training, I'm a roboticist. I did my PhD here at Stanford many years back. And then after that, I've been in the field of robotics and AI. But it's about 2 or 3 years ago, I started to get into the field of education, more specifically K-12 education. So the main reason that drives me into this field is actually the fast advancing of technology in the field of AI and robotics. You might be wondering, why is that? So that's because actually I not only do research, but I also do investment in the AI and robotics. So I've seen many great startups, companies, and teams' ideas. And then as a father of 2, the more I see them, the more I become worried about them. Because I'm in that kind of education system on a daily basis. They're all in K-12. And then once on the one side, I see all these companies are doing great stuff, like this way. And then in K-12, and the kids are doing this. So at 2 different, kind of in my view, directions. And I become worried. See, here, a typical pitch from a startup company in the field of AI and robotics usually start with like this. They'll say, by using our technology or using our robot, you will be able to replace this many people and save this much money. Okay? So that's how usually they pitch. And then it becomes more and more clear in the next 10, 20 years, a lot of these robots with AI will go ahead and replace a lot of people's job. So, well, here, I want to make a claim that I'm a very optimistic person. I know robotics and AI. So I totally believe that the technology in AI and robotics will create a lot of jobs, a lot of new jobs for us. However, the bigger issue is that the people who are capable of doing these new jobs are not the same group of people who get replaced by the technology or by the robots. How are we going to do with this? And also, in the next 10, 20, 30 years, we are getting to a phase that our education system will gradually change, either fast or slow. And it has to get to the point that it can create people who can succeed in the era of robotics and AI. And the research I'm doing here at Stanford School of Engineering is trying to push this thing to happen faster. And I feel the pain every day because I have 2 kids in the school. So, and then, here's the thing. There's 2 basic things about AI and kids' education. So the first thing is how to use AI technology in the learning setup to help learning and teaching. AI is a tool. And then a tool could be used in a good way and bad way. I think in most cases, it will be good. It will help on learning. But in some other corner cases, if we don't design it carefully enough, it might put negative effects on learning. So that's one area. The second area I'm very interested in is how we reinvent the education system as a whole, that which can create people who can differentiate themselves from robots in the future. So AI is machine intelligence. Machine intelligence and human intelligence are two very, very different types of intelligence. And actually, instead of competing with each other, they are actually very, very complementary to each other. They can help each other. So I think the goal for our education system for the future is to how we can educate students in the way that they know how to differentiate themselves from robots so that they can use robots to make our society better. So to do that, I'm working on to get a group of experts in different domains like education, AI, robotics, design, neuroscience to work together to tackle these issues.
I'm Krista Santos. I actually work with Liz over at Catalia Health. I'm leading hardware engineering for that. I'm helping them to develop their robotic platform named Meibu, and we are currently tackling the problem of chronic illness management in the home. But the reason I'm here for this Children in AI panel is based on a lot of the research that I did in my graduate work. So back in undergrad, I was doing mechanical engineering, and I happened to join a lab by the name of the Personal Robots Group that is headed by Cynthia Brazil. Some people might know that name. But I got to work on a really interesting project by the name of the Huggable Project, and this was headed by Walter Dan Steele at the time. And the Huggable Project was this cute, cuddly teddy bear robot that was being developed for kids for many different purposes. They were looking at education, they were looking at healthcare, they were looking at like long-distance interaction, and what needed to be done was to be able to develop a platform that could go out into the wild and actually interact with children, because what I quickly learned in my time there, I wound up spending the 4 years of my undergrad also working with them, but I also did my graduate work with them as a master's student with the Media Arts and Science program at the Media Lab. What happens is that when you're trying to develop a robot, or basically just an AI that has a bit of character, as we tend to develop, especially with children, we always want to create this lovable, constant character that they can kind of relate to. What happens is when you put that in a physical form, sometimes it doesn't always work out the way you expect. And that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, with developing robots like Cosmo, robots like Jibo, or our robot, Meibu. Whatever character that you're trying to create to put in front of your main audience, whether it be the elderly, children, or all of us, you have to make sure that that mechanical and physical platform that you're putting in front of them is actually being able to translate all of the things that it means to translate with its motion. Because if you're creating something electromechanical, you got to make sure that a blink or a wink or a lean in with intent or excitement or a lean back with surprise actually translates the way that you would expect. So with a couple of the robots that I helped develop over at the Media Lab, that we were working on that. Because what happened is a lot of the research that we would do, there weren't no platforms to actually do that research. So we had to develop a lot of the platforms in-house. So my mechanical engineering background helped complement a lot of the psychology, computer science, and electrical engineering that was existing in this lab to be able to create platforms such as the Huggable Project for eventually what was going to be a research project at the Boston Children's Hospital. DragonBot, who is now being used in research with second language learning for kids, and a couple of different other projects. So that's kind of why I'm here, and that's what I'm hoping to talk about, the whole physicality of like bringing an AI to life in front of children.
So Dan, could you start us off and talk a little bit about how do you introduce kids to the idea of AI in an educational setting?
Well, I don't introduce them to the concept of AI.
When
I
you're working,
introduce them to the idea that you're teaching this intelligent character.
and how do you do that?
Doesn't take much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a narrative they get, and they enjoy seeing the character's independent behavior. So it's not nothing special. Well, the hard part is all the interaction design, so they don't get bogged down.
Right. So the key is to make it as simple as possible?
Yeah, we tried. At one point, we tried to be too clever. We would have the agent talk back to the kid and sort of say, "I don't think you taught me correctly," and the kids really disliked that. Right.
Interesting.
It just didn't work. Right.
Sandy, how does that work in a more physical embodiment of a robot?
Well, we do. So there are playful interactions you can have with Cosmo, but some of those are somewhat learning, where you learn how to play a game and get better at it. But then we also have part of his app that we call Code Lab, and it's block-based programming, where you get to build programs, both horizontal Scratch programming and also vertical. You can kind of level up to that. And then you get to see the actions that you programmed appear physically on the robot. And we found that physicality really adds a dimension that is very engaging for kids. Because, I mean, they've all played, well, most of them have played with programming games where it's a screen and, it's pixel-based, and those can be really, entertaining. But then to have this, this thing in front of you, it's in real life and it's moving around and making noises and, looking at you and having facial expressions, and, that kind of takes it to another level. Especially there's some kids where you almost need that to keep them engaged.
Right. And what are some circumstances what are some things that you look for when you see that somebody needs to be kept engaged a little bit? What are some of the danger signs?
Well, it's with all of the kind of kid-based stuff that I've done. It's, kids sort of, their mind wanders, they get distracted, they're not riveted to what's going on. But definitely, we're talking about sort of character-based behaviors. I think the character side of Cosmo and robots like him are what make it, that lifelike behavior, I think, is what is engaging about them, because he seems real. I mean, we've actually, and this was completely a surprise, we've had a lot of anecdotal, very positive feedback of parents and teachers of kids with varying levels of autism, who have a very hard time relating to human beings and understanding their emotions, and sometimes will just shut them out. And almost across the board, they have an incredibly positive reaction to Cosmo, and they will talk to him and interact with him on a level that they won't with real people. And then a lot of times that will help them build up their confidence, so then that can expand to include human beings. And that was unexpected, but we're exploring that because it's pretty fantastic.
That's incredible. And Lee, I think you had something
Well,
to
I just
respond
want to share some of my personal experience with my second son. Well, you just asked how to introduce an AI or robot to a kid. And my experience was you don't need to do that, because I still remember when my second son was around a year and a half old. And then I never really introduced any kind of AI or robots to my son. And then one day, I was just pointing at some book and say, "What's this?" And he was like, "That's a robot." And then I said, "What's this?" "That's a person." I said, "What's this?" "That's a robot." And he was 90% right. And some of the robot doesn't really look like a robot, but that's why I get so amazed about this human intelligence, because that's something really hard, I think, for how to say, the AI to do with that limit number of samples. And also, the things I pointed, because I know AI, so I really pointed at some weird shape stuff. And he actually get it mostly right. And I was amazed that you're only a year and a half. So my feeling is that this generation, they grew up with this. You don't need to introduce them. Right? So
That's so interesting. And Scott, how about you?
I was just going to ask the all-important question. So did you ever ask them why they thought that was a robot?
He's not capable of answering that question. Yes, I tried. I said, "Why?" Isn't that a robot? So
no, it's interesting to just understand kids today what they understand a robot actually is, because that is a very dangerous question, especially to a lot of roboticists. Is when you ask them what is a robot, it's just depending on who you ask, it's a varied answer. But from the kid point of view,
and also I actually tried a bunch of basically pictures that I searched online. For example, the RoboCop and that kind of stuff. I kind of feel he probably never saw that before, and say, "What's this?" And he's like, "That's a robot." I'm like, "Wow."
So Scott, when you're working with a conversational interaction, do you feel like there's a lot of build-up when you're working with kids, or explanation, or you need to introduce them to the idea, or is it as seamless as that?
There's a lot of variety when it comes to interacting with kids. Some kids, you've just burst the dam. As soon as there's a chance for them to talk to someone, particularly if they feel like it's a peer relationship instead of talking to an adult, it just comes out in a torrent. You cannot shut them up, and that's I love those transcripts. There are other kids who are a little more afraid. They'll talk all day. As soon as you put the thing in front of them and ask them a question, sometimes they'll. And then we've also seen, like I saw this was kind of amazing in the Fisher-Price testing. If their parent was in the room, they would sort of get deferential and kind of look at their parent what to do. If you took the parent out of the room and they were on their own, suddenly, oh, it's up to me. I don't, and then this person's not listening to what I say anymore. I can be more myself. So there isn't sort of one way, but the way I would design was for the tougher cases. I would always try to start, I even do this with adults actually, yeah. I would start them off with a very simple interaction, very low stakes, let's just go through the act of talking back to me without even really making a thing out of it. And then once you can find a way to make that a satisfying interaction, you've kind of broken the ice a little bit and you can start to ramp up the complexity. So I don't think there's one way or there's one type of kid in my experience, but I think the safe bet is to design for the tough cases, because the people who are ready to talk, they'll blitz right through that. It'll barely slow them down.
And I would definitely second that if you're developing for children, the testing is a whole different beast. It's so important to test kids without parents in the room if possible, and be ready for anything.
Dan, what kind of learning opportunities does working with a teachable agent or AI in the classroom present?
So generally we do it where it's socially promotive. So you're trying to help and do this. And like I said, when we use symbolic AI, where it's modeling how people think, the kids really pick that up. And it helps make it visual so they can see how the thinking's going. Just on the prior, for a while we were exploring the significance of realism, how real to make these things, and ran into funny things. Like we would ask kids, our question wasn't, is it a robot? Our question was, is it alive?
Oh, that's a good question.
And then you get an insight into the child's mind. So do I need to turn this on? They go, yes. How about if it's turned off and there's a fire? Will it jump off the couch? Yes. And you begin to realize they don't really have any coherent story underneath. So, but what we decided was, instead of go for realism, go for narratives that they understand. So they have some narrative structure to guide the interaction, and it sounds like that in the writing, that's sort of the goal.
That is a huge help. The narrative. It guides the conversation. It allows you to kind of nudge them back on the rails in a way that feels believable instead of bossy.
Yeah.
But the context aspect of it is huge. So yeah, narrative's a big plus.
Sandy, how important is storytelling when you're working with a physical robot like Kosmos?
It's funny. I was just thinking that we did within Anki develop like a whole backstory for Kosmos, but then we never really used it because it's so much about his direct interaction with you, and it's almost like you, from day one, when you first turn him on and he sees your face and learns your name and recognizes you, and it's like you're building a story with Kosmos, and it's the story of you and Kosmos. So we actually don't really need to have a backstory for him. Kids just dive in and start, putting personality onto him and making up their own stories, and in fact, coming up with their own narratives. There was one play pattern that one kid had that hadn't even occurred to me when we were designing the activity. There's one activity that is called Kosmos Says, and it's Kosmos doesn't talk. He just says your name. That's the only word he can say. But there is a little activity where you can type something in and then press a button, and he'll go blah, and then he'll say it. And he doesn't really know what he's saying, you know, but you're making him say it. But there was this one child who had him, like, she sort of incorporated him into her cast of characters made up of her stuffed animals and her dolls and everything. And she would make up these entire stories, and he would say his lines by typing it into the app and then making him say it. So he was a star of her cast.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, no, it's a good point of like being able to allow the child to kind of construct that story on their own, and about being able to incorporate some aspects of realism. Because when you're designing a physical form for a lot of these robots, I think part of the realization is like, okay, how real do I have to make that? Like, especially so with the Huggable, like we were creating a teddy bear, but we already kind of knew the child would realize like, oh, well, a teddy bear doesn't really come to life. So there's already aspects of this that aren't real, so sure, we can make it with like blue fur. Like there's already some aspects that we can just say, okay, well, this is now part of what the Huggable is. So instead of deciding like, oh, okay, well, it's kind of like this, and trying to make it as close to the real thing as possible. For instance, like with the Dragon Bot's, like, well, the Dragon Bot's not actually quite what you would think of like a medieval dragon would look like or anything, but it was just kind of this squash and stretch little character with wings that we called a dragon. But what was more important was like how the interaction would happen with the child and what story was taking place. So that I think is definitely the big thing to focus on, especially when you're trying to develop a robot, not just for like play and commercial aspect, but for research. Like being able to try to get some sort of research point out of that.
Well, what kinds of questions can interacting with AI bring up for kids? Dan, you talked about a few really intriguing questions that you actually asked, but what kinds of other questions might come up?
So we're talking young children?
In your experience, it could be younger, older.
So this discussion's largely been about younger children.
Yeah.
So we did some studies where it was also attempting to make a robot for a child who's going into sort of medical procedures. And their job was to teach the robot not to be scared. And the thought was the kid would develop bravado. And so and it was a very cute cat, and we put it in front, and the kid's showing the cat, and then the cat twitches its tail. And the kid just broke out in tears. So I'm not sure how that answers your question.
We tried that with the Huggable at varying levels of success.
Yeah.
I think the question I would ask you is...
So in the kid's head, I don't know what question was being formed at that moment. I think it may have been more, I don't know what this is.
Right.
The one I've seen is when you put a character in front of a kid, particularly a character they don't know. We've done original characters, and then we started working with brands. They do want to know about the character. They have a list of questions. They're fairly predictable that they ask, a lot of what's your favorite, where you're from, how old's a big one, because that's kind of a kid pecking order thing. But they do want to know about the character, and then so one of the things we worked on a lot was kind of being able to answer those questions and sort of, okay, back to the thing I need now. So we would honor it, but we would also try to sort of keep the conversation moving in the direction we needed it to, just because of content limitations. But yeah, they tend to want to know who they're talking to.
Right.
And also, actually, the form factor of the robot with the AI play some, I won't say a big role, but we have already observed some kind of difference. For example, when we talk a robot, usually, I don't know if people think about like Echo as a robot. It is a form factor that doesn't move at all. So then, if you compare when children interact with Echo versus children interact with a robot that moves, for example, like Jibo, then the interaction is very different. And then, for example, like some research have done, like in Cornell, like one of my friends, and he told me that they observed when children try to interact with Alexa, because it has all these limitations on the ASR, so children try to speak in a very strict way, choose the simple words, which means that they become rude. And,
Yes.
and then they develop that kind of habit of speaking, and then they will transfer that to talking with human. So actually, they are nicer to a robot like Jibo because it moves, and so that kind of thing happens.
You're absolutely right, because it occurs on a conversation design level as well, because when they learn how to talk to Siri and Alexa, they're sort of probing it with questions until it fails, and that teaches them how to give job interviews. If you want to teach them how to talk to people, you kind of need to engage them more in a structured conversation where there's something at stake, and where you actually have to give them a little responsibility, I think is the key. Because then once they've taken that on, then they sort of get that it's more of a two-way street. It becomes more of a peer conversation. So yeah, both what you're saying on a speech level, and I think on a way the interaction is designed, that's not an ideal conversation for kids.
Yeah. And one form factor issue with Kosmos, when we first released pictures of him before he was actually in stores, and then we would kid test with the physical robot, they were amazed because they had seen the posters and they thought he was bigger. So they thought maybe he was like this big, and then because he's got like a lift in his tread wheels, and he's only this big, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, he's so much smaller."
And maybe fooled me as well.
But it ended up being a positive thing, because I think had he been that big, he would actually be a bit frightening and potentially pinchy, and that. Whereas this big, he's almost hamster sized, and you kind of want to protect him, and nobody's afraid of Cosmo. I don't.
So in some ways, you're asking, what does the kid have in mind? And so we did a study with college students where there's a character in virtual reality. It's immersive. It didn't need to be, but it was. And you're either told this character is a robot, or this character, there's a person behind this character. And you ask people afterwards, they sort of forget which condition they're in. But it turns out if you think it's a person, you learn a lot more.
Interesting.
And your arousal's higher. And your eye gaze is different.
Well, why do you think that is?
Because it's a person.
Yeah.
I care what the person thinks.
Right.
I'm not sure I care what the AI thinks. So.
That's interesting. So I know that there's been some concern about like AI getting so good that it tricks us into thinking it's a person, but from that standpoint, that is almost a positive thing in some contexts. And you wouldn't want to tell the person, because then you would break the fact that it was really good.
So I don't know. I mean, as an adult, my main thought when I'm dealing with something that I think is maybe not really smart is to try and break it.
Yeah.
To figure out, can I ask it the question it can't answer?
Yeah.
And do you think that's a little bit of what's going on with the children in Alexa and Siri? They're trying to test the limits, break it?
A lot, yes. I think with Siri and Alexa, I mean, I watch my own kids. They definitely are, probing for the fences like the velociraptors. The thing to get them off that is to engage them in a way so they feel like there's something at stake. They're going to be rewarded for continuing down a path as opposed to sort of breaking out of it and doing their own thing. When they get disengaged, then you start to see that same behavior. You start to see just see if I can break this thing. And that's it doesn't speak ill of them. I mean, it's a good, curious behavior, but if you're trying to have a successful conversational experience sort of on your terms, or if Mattel needs you to, then you've got to work a little harder to sort of keep them moving in the direction you want them to go.
But I wonder if the AI and if the personality was better, if that would change. Because if they felt more of an emotional attachment, maybe they would be less rude or less, poke it with a stick. And,
so is it just me, or is that creepy?
But
I don't know. To have a pet that I sort of start believing is alive.
It's a great question. It's a really great question. Because on the one hand, yes, there's certainly an uncanny valley. I've seen many products that fall into it. But it's funny you were bringing up like the blue teddy bear and things. It's like making things not look real, make them look like what they are. So like we have a bunch of robotic examples at work, and one of them is this Robo Kitty that like was used as a comfort animal, and everyone is terrified of that thing, even though it's pretty and furry and everything, but it's like and it's like turn it off, and it's funny. It's like that you have to be careful of that because it does get creepy.
The anthropologist, Claude Lévi-Strauss, he sort of asked at one point, why are all statues bigger or smaller than people, as opposed to being the same size? And his answer was, it's enough like the person so you can bring that schema to bear, but because it's a different size, it releases your imagination. So being in a room with a bunch of characters that are really, I think they're real cats, may not release my imagination. But
Right.
the blue's a good touch. You know?
Yeah.
A lot of it comes to expectation management. If you set that expectation consciously or subconsciously, it's going to be perfect human fidelity conversation, and then you fail that, it's pretty jarring. So you see a lot of customer service bots these days. They tend to introduce themselves as bots. They're very personable. They have feelings. They get upset when they get it wrong. But they set your expectations at the start. So I think, rather than shooting for human fidelity, I think shooting for empathy is probably the better answer, because if they feel like the character cares what they think, they may be less inclined to treat it like an appliance. And it doesn't have to be, I know this is a 100% sentient thing, but as long as they sort of know what to expect and they feel like they have some stake in it, I think, then you'll start to see more noble behavior out of them.
Yeah, well, and actually, there was I wish I could remember what the research it was, but they had discovered that robots that were fallible were more endearing to human beings than robots that did everything perfectly and exactly right.
I'll tell you a story. This was on the Thomas the Tank Engine app. Now, Thomas has a lot of fans that are 3 to 6. Thomas also has a lot of fans that are well outside that age bracket. So there's a part at the beginning where we're just teaching the children how to use the mic button. So Thomas rolls up the station. He says, press and hold the mic button, say hello, Thomas. So the teenager pressed hold and said, F you, Thomas. And Thomas responded with, bust my buffers, I hope you didn't say what I think you just said. And then his next volley was, I'm sorry, I just got So once he sort of understood that was a little bit out of bounds and that there were actually consequences to that, he backed right off. So it was, and then this person sounded like he was 15. So, but still, that kind of, again, he's not expecting it to be 100%, but just understanding that there's a consequence of that and that you don't have complete autonomy. Suddenly, I better watch it.
Testing the boundaries.
Yeah.
So, Lee, how do you think growing up surrounded by AI that's getting better and more lifelike, even though, we've talked a lot today about how it's not necessarily like human lifelike, but how is this going to affect children's perception of the world as they grow?
I think it's important to let children at early age, as early as possible, that they know how the AI works and how the robots works, and they get the idea. We're not really talking about the mathematics behind it, and we're just talking about some concept. And actually, we ran some pilot study to get a group of students, like ranging from 2nd grade all the way up to like 11th grade, and we're just trying. So I massage the graduate level robotic class, and I get rid of all these very hard mathematics and try to get the concept. And I taught them in one class, and I'm trying to figure out where that boundary is. Yeah. That right below what grade it's hard to teach. Right. Above what grade it's actually okay. And that turned out to be the 3rd grade. So anyone above 3rd grade, I actually managed to teach them the basic robotic concept, like the degrees of freedom, whatever things used in there. They all get it. And that actually strikes me. I'm like, wow, okay, this really shows
pretty
something.
Incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it shows something. We don't need to wait until graduate school to teach those things. And actually, the basic concept of AI, and right now all the things were driven by the deep learning thing, it's not that difficult to explain if we get rid of other mathematics. Once they understand that, they can apply that in their life and trying to better use of AI, I would say. Right? So, I feel that's important. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question correctly, but yeah.
No, that was perfect. Dan, do you think we should be afraid of letting kids interact with AI?
Just coming off of that, right?
Yes, if it's very bad AI with evil intent, yes, we don't. So, I have to admit, all the discussions about, AI, smart AI taking over the world, I'm still more concerned about dumb humans than smart AI. So I think I'm going to defer on that one.
How about you, Sandy? Do you think there's fear that we should have? And
Well, one thing I've learned after spending 2 years at a robotics company is that we are nowhere near as advanced as the average person thinks.
That's right.
That's the dirty secret of the robot.
Yes, exactly. I just say that in front of a microphone. But there may be a time when things become able to learn to a degree that we lose control of it. But that is not going to happen next week or even in the next decade or so. I mean, I'm not going to speculate, but we're a long way off from that. And I do think that there's a lot of problems that technology can really help solve. And so there's a way more potential, I think, than there is danger. And also, we're humans and we're in charge of it. So, let's design things carefully and with responsibility.
Kris?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's definitely not a fear. I think it's more about what is the actual purpose of what we're putting in front of the child. Because I think what some companies I think want to do is be able to create these things that can do anything, but they haven't decided on doing one thing well yet. Mm-hmm. So like trying to choose one thing to do well, like for example, like second language learning, like being able to either teach the child or have the child teach the robot a second language, like work on that, do that really well. Mm-hmm. And then see where else you can expand upon like these little purposes. I think that's like the more important thing to focus on is like when, because I mean there are a lot of robotic toys out there that have like these really fun functions, like it can sing and dance and all these other things, but what is it actually doing with the child that is like beneficial for that type of interaction? Because a lot of parents will buy them to like, oh, okay, this will entertain the child for a couple more hours, that'll buy me some time or something. But it's not about a fear. It's like I think it's more about like a beneficial purpose that should be like the course of development for like AI and robotics.
Actually, talking about the second language, there's one thing I want to share with this group is that I talked with a professor in the linguistic department a few weeks back, and he was telling me some shocking news. So basically, in the past, well, let's say starting from maybe around 2000, right? At Stanford, the number of people or students who take second language learning, just keep going up, right? Until 3 years ago. And then from 3 years ago, it dropped like almost 40% across the board. So no matter that's Spanish or French or Chinese, whatever, the number of enrollment dropped significantly. And that actually is not just Stanford. It happens in MIT, Harvard, Princeton also, and all these good universities. And we don't know why, but one reason people might think is that a lot of students might think, okay, well, the machine translation will get good enough so that we don't need to learn that anymore. But it's still shocking.
I would just add, I think martial artists say you fight like you train. So as people start to have more and more synthetic conversation, I think the responsibility is to have those synthetic conversations still demand a little respect, demand a little bit of at least somewhat equal treatment, demand to actually be heard as well, in addition to hearing what the kid says. Because if people start to have more and more synthetic conversations where it doesn't matter what they say, where they can get away with murder, one way or another that's going to translate to human interaction. So I think if the character, the AI, whatever you choose to call it, can stick up for itself a little bit, rewards listening, rewards good behavior, whatever it does in terms of substituting for human conversation, it at least won't start to build bad habits that could bleed over into real life conversation.
Sandy, what do you think some of the responsibilities are in terms of designing for children, for maybe a more physical?
Well, it's interesting.
Present.
I mean, one of the things I just thought of was that we have built in some behaviors into Cosmo where if you rough handle him, he will eventually get upset. We have a mechanic where you can shake him and he'll make a funny noise and his eyes rattle and things. But we have different levels of shaking. And so, if you shake him a little bit, he'll kind of, be a bit wobbly and then he'll recover. But if you shake him really hard, he actually gets upset and almost kind of does a Cosmo fetal behavior and it's like you've hurt him and eventually he'll recover. But it was a big discussion in terms of the character and the behavior of the robot. Like, is that what we want, or should he always just be, oh, he's a wacky character? And we went with, no, you should be, teaching some level of responsibility, and he's a character that we want you to care about. And it comes into that, well, if I think it's fake, I'm going to keep poking it with a stick, and so we erred on that side of, more alive, being a better thing.
We did the same thing conversationally in a couple things. We built a penalty box. So if people started to really abuse it, it's, no, you do that again, you're in trouble. Then they say something mean again. We'd actually lock them in a conversation loop where the character wouldn't respond to anything other than I'm sorry for about 5 minutes.
Oh, that's
and so either after 5 minutes they'd go, all right, just don't do that again. Or is it, look, I'm sorry, I apologize. Really? Okay, fine. And then, but you would actually, we would disengage people from our chat bot if they just continued to abuse it, because we figured they were gone anyway. We just had to be careful because people curse as a part of emphatic agreement, but then if they're actually saying something abusive,
right,
then you have to be able to discern that. So handwritten rules, very important.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Dan, how do you think AI can change education, or is changing education in your experience?
So I think the fastest action right now is not on thinking of new ways to teach. And it's too bad, because there's technology allows us to do things we could never do before, like simulations, science simulations. You couldn't manipulate glaciers before. The place where the AI is showing up is on looking at the data, diagnosing trajectories, trying to make decisions about where to shuttle a child one way or another. And so the challenge here is getting the right data sets. So if you get data sets out of an environment that is really very linear and it's right-wrong, then the only thing the AI is going to pick up is moving forward or backward. And it's not so interesting. You'd like to be able to get AI to be able to look at people in sort of open, constructive environments and try and detect things and suggest you might try this at this point. But I think that's where the action is. It's really the detection of things, and then humans will make decisions about, given that detection, what should it do next.
Right. That's really interesting. And Scott, do you see that kind of detection in designing for conversation?
Sorry, a little more specific, the type of detection.
So my claim is that most of the advanced AI right now is really making fast advances at the ability to recognize stuff. And so in education, it's going to be able to recognize a kid who I see his eye gaze and I realize, oh, he has a reading disability. And I can detect things like that. Or I can detect he's having problems in math, which is quite different than the technology being proactive about what the kid should get.
Well, it's funny, in conversation design right now, we're getting a very thin slice of human communication, which is words. And not even all of them. Eventually you want to get tone. We actually, that's not true. We can understand words and we can program in context by doing so by hand. But detecting other things like those nonverbals, tone, sort of emotion, speed, those are all things that could lend meaning to words. And right now the conversation industry is pretty dead in the water there, but I have faith it'll catch up. In terms of saying sort of what you put out into the interaction, or
how are you using in your design any kind of detection from the AI to the user?
Not as much as we would like.
Right.
Right now, it's pretty much all we can script against is words. Now, a lot of the industry uses machine learning for this. And my comparison is the Sorcerer's Apprentice short from Fantasia, where you build, if it hears that, it should respond. And then it swells up to encompass everything. And the actual sort of, conversation is very fine, it's very subtle, it has a lot of meaning. So then we throw this computer at it that goes, and it detects way too much. So my advocacy in this world is for a human being to actually just go down the rabbit hole and detect and anticipate and detect as many fine-grained kind of things as humanly possible. And that's testing, that's sitting there staring at something going, what's another way to say that? Oh, okay. And really, I think it demands a human touch. I think the industry is kind of veering in a bad way with machine learning. And I'm not against it. I think it'll get there. right now I think it's the wrong tool for understanding the many wonderful layers of human communication and speech. And so I spent 5 years doing it by hand, and I don't regret any of them. I think we were able to do a lot of really cool things that way.
Yeah. How about you, Lee? How do you see education being changed by AI?
There are a lot of different ways that AI can potentially change education. I'll give you some controversial examples. One thing I've seen that there's a company are doing apps to help student to study, which means to help them to find answers. So which means they use this, image AI. The children just need, okay, I don't know how to solve this problem. I take a picture of it, and then boom, answer right there. So that's actually, I don't think it's a good way of using AI, although they made it very popular though, especially in China. So because they have a lot of homeworks. And then to do these homeworks takes a lot of time. And then if they stuck on one problem for, let's say, 5 minutes, they say, I'll use this app. Maybe, I don't know their business model. Maybe they charge like 10 cents for each question or whatever. But, that really get rid of the chance for the student to really think about this. Like when we were studying, we were stuck on one problem for like 1 day or two. And you just, I have to solve this, right? And then that's where you learn a lot.
Yes.
And then with this thing, you try to find 5 minutes, and then, okay, I give up, I'll get the answer, and then put it on there.
Yeah, and I worry about just the deeper effects of that. Like you lose your tenacity, your ability to, put up with something for not knowing something for a couple of days.
The theme here seems to be some degree of pushback.
Yeah.
If it comes too easy, if it's too subservient, that it actually winds up not being beneficial. But going closer to real life, where people you engage with have their own wants and require some compromise, just the closer you can get to that seems to be better. And I think, fortunately, using real life as a model generally seems to be the right call.
So I'm going to assert my point again. That I think the place the AI is going to make its dent in education, at least in the short run, is on assessment, testing. It's the recognition. And if you look at where money is made in education, it's in tests.
That's true.
So I appreciate your venture capital, go get them. But if you really want to make money, go make a test using AI.
Yeah, especially actually, I think a lot of people are trying to do this essay grading because a lot of English teachers, they spend a lot of time grade these papers, and AI is on the horizon for able doing that. So yeah.